Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to all our participants. We are thrilled to have you joined us today for our 10th HSBooster training session from the Standardization in Practice series. Today, our topic could only be related to terminology standards. However, this training session will be much more than what we planned. We name it terminology in practice, development, dissemination, accessibility, and their impact at national culture. In this training session, you will gain insight from three perspectives. One from national standardization viewpoint, the second from national language and communication, and third from business. Our presenters will explore these perspectives through the lens of the Norwegian case. Thank you for your time and willingness to spend it with us. I'm Ivana Mijatovic. I'm the lead of HSBooster Training Academy, and I'm happy to announce that we have fantastic speakers again. Today with us are Emanuela Rocke and Ivo Spira from National Standardization Body of Norway, Standards Norway. Asse Vetas, Director of the Language Council of Norway, and Magnus Hagvag, CEO of House of Knowledge and convener of the ISO Working Group on Innovation Management Terminology. I will say a few words about our trainers today. Emanuela Rocke is the Business Area Manager for Mobility and Digitalisation at National Standardization Body of Norway. Emanuela is also one of the experts in STAIR group dedicated on joint work on standardization, innovation, and research, created to provide strategic advice to Senelec. Emanuela is member of external advisory group of Standards.eu, a research project founded by European Union. Emanuela has university degree in translation from University of Trieste and MBA in strategy, leadership and finance from BI Norwegian School of Management. She is keenly interested in languages as a key enabler for international business and innovation. She has an excellent understanding of the standardization world through several years of experience in testing, inspection, and certification industry, and now in Standards Norway. Ivo Spira is a project manager in the areas of terminology and language technology at Standards Norway. Ivo has PhD in linguistics and Chinese from the University of Oslo. He has researched etymology, Chinese conceptual history, and language development. Asse Vetas is Director of Language Council of Norway. She has PhD in Scandinavian Studies and has worked with language standardization and lexicology for 25 years. The Language Council is a strategic node for coordination of terminology work in Norwegian, offers training in terminology work, and facilitates the establishment of terminology groups across public and private sectors in Norway. Our fourth presenter is Magnus Hagvag. He is the CEO of House of Knowledge, and he has over 20 years of experience in innovation, IP and IPR, and of course standardization. Magnus served as convener of the ISO Working Group on Innovation Management Terminology, which published ISO 56000. And he was involved in revising OECD Oslo Manual. Let me say a few words about today's training. Terminology is a core of any kind of communication dissemination of result, particularly concerning emerging of disruptive technologies. Terminology is a crucial starting point in all research and innovation initiatives, especially those revolving around digital transformation, digitalisation, and increased efficiency. So today's speaker will look into how terminology represents the link among emerging technologies, research results, and standardization. I'm eagerly anticipating the insights of trainers, insights our trainers will offer to us today. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded and a copy will be available on our website afterwards. Additionally, we will share relevant resources and materials for your further exploration. We value your input, and please put your question in our Q&A feature to share your thought or ask any questions to our presenters. Emanuela, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ivana, for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting Standards Norway to present at this training session. Standardization for research and innovation is very important, and HSBooster Standardization Training Academy is doing a great job in organizing these training sessions. We're very happy to be invited here today. So yes, my name is Emanuela Rocche, and I am business area manager in Standards Norway, and we will go to the next slide. I will give you a brief introduction of what is Standards Norway and why standards. And also I am here with my colleague Ivo Spira, who will then talk about terminology and standards and also the ongoing work with standardization. And then we'll go to the next. I will tell you a little bit about Standards Norway now. So Standards Norway is based in Oslo, Norway. We are a private, not-for-profit member organization. Our members represent the private and public sector, industry, academia, research and innovation. We were established in 2003 when various Norwegian standardization organizations merged. And the oldest dates back to 1923. So last year, we actually celebrated our first 100-year anniversary. We are a global company. Standards Norway is the Norwegian member of the International Standardization Organization, ISO, and of the European Standardization Organization, CEST. And we also follow the European Commission's standardization work closely. Standards Norway has the responsibility in Norway for standardization work within most sectors, excluding electrotechnical and telecom, which are the responsibility of other authorities. We are approximately 85 employees, and Standards Norway is the owner and publisher of Norwegian standard, Norsk Standard, which is a protected trademark. And we go to the next. Here is a slide showing you a little bit the landscape of standardization organizations, and to show you how Standards Norway fits into that picture. As I said, we represent ISO and CEST in Norway, and we are actually part of a group of companies. We have Standards Norway, the standardization body, and then we also have a company called Standard Online, who has responsibility for sales of standards and for courses in standardization, and Standards Digital, which is an IT company for standardization. I told you earlier that we don't have responsibility for the electrotechnical standards. That is the responsibility of the Norwegian Electrotechnical Committee, and the telecom standards. That's the responsibility of the Norwegian Communication Authority. We'll go to the next slide. Standards for innovation and research. There is an increased focus on standards for research and innovation in the EU standardization strategy, and also we work very much with that here in Standards Norway. Standards can increase the value of dissemination of research findings, and standardization projects can uncover knowledge needs that can lead to new research projects. We see that in Horizon Europe, in an increasing number of calls for proposals for research funded by Horizon Europe, it has a positive impact if the research results are used in standardization work. So we in Standards Norway collaborate with research and innovation environments, both nationally and internationally, to provide input on how standardization can strengthen applications. And we participate in research projects funded, for example, by the Norwegian Research Council and by Horizon Europe. The next slide. Two very important documents that you should make sure that you all read are the Code of Practice on Standardization in the European Research Area and the Code of Practice on Industry-Academia Co-Creation for Knowledge Valorization. These documents give important recommendations on how standardization can be an effective tool to make the best use of the results of research and innovation projects. I have added the links to those documents that you can use to get to see the documents. So Standards Norway work with the terminology. We are engaged in the development of terms, in collecting and structuring terms from the Library of Standards, and in publishing terms in close comparison with the Language Council of Norway, who is also presenting here today. And Standards Norway translates standards into Norwegian on a regular basis, and this work is partly funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Culture and Equity. I see that time goes by very quickly, so I'll move on to the next and next again. Yes, standards are all around us, and they play a significant role in our lives, even if they are often hard to notice. In a way, they represent what works. And imagine a world without standards. Well, in our opinion, that would be a world of chaos. We can go to the next. This is another example of, for example, if you think of credit cards, the technology behind credit cards is regulated by standards, which make it possible to use the same solution all over the world. So, for example, we avoid having to use different cards according to the country where we travel, for example. So standards can be seen as a common platform on which one can build innovation. A standard is a technical document designed to be used as a rule, guideline, or definition. So standardization is a democratic process where everybody is invited to participate. Standards give best practice on which to build innovation. There are standards for basically everything, from products and materials to processes and services. And they contribute to increased safety, quality, competitiveness, and market access. Who makes standards? It's actually committees, standardization committees, who define the content of standards. We have more than 3,000 Norwegian experts who participate nationally and internationally. And these committees include professionals from the entire spectrum of society and business. It is very important to have multiple stakeholder groups to represent multiple perspectives and have a balanced composition in the different committees. So, for example, you will find representatives of business, industry, authorities, trade unions, and so on. Terminology and standards, a good fit. So standards ensure that we can go to the next slide. Standards ensure that specific terms are used consistently across domains, industries, or professions. And this consistency enhances communication and reduces ambiguity. And also standards help maintain the quality of terminology. They define best practices, ensuring that terminology is accurate, precise, and reliable. And in technical fields, standards facilitate interoperability. For example, standardized medical terminology allows different healthcare systems to exchange information seamlessly. When it comes to domain-specific standards, different fields have their own standards. For instance, programming languages adhere to specific syntax and terminology defined by industry standards. So, in summary, we can say that standards provide a framework for creating and using terminology effectively. So here's an overview of how we work from idea and needs to the finished standard. And the development of terminology in standardization is a dynamic process which is shaped by collaboration and practical application. It is an iterative process like the plan, do, check, act cycle. It's a continuous loop to recognize opportunities, to act and put in use and revise. And the main principles of standardization are openness, voluntary work, and consensus. So the development of standards takes place in an open and democratic way where everybody can contribute. And standardization work by experts is voluntary, so it's not remunerated. We are very grateful to people who decide to be involved in standardization, and it's a process based on consensus. Yes, going back to standards and terminology, this is a practical example. We have the new ISO 59000 family of standards for circular economy, and you will see that ISO 59004 is the standards for vocabulary, principles, and guidance for implementation. With the new international standards for circular economy, we will have a common international terminology and conceptual framework and a common direction for the way forward. We can communicate with each other more easily when we get a standardized starting point for what the circular economy is across industries and national borders. So we will have, we can go to the next and last slide, and we will know what the terms mean, and we will have a common understanding of the different concepts. And actually, we will have Standards Norway has a very important event on the 18th of June in Oslo, where we will launch these standards. So more information on our website. So that was all for me. And now my colleague Ivo Spira will present more on terminology and standard.
Yes, thank you, Emanuela. Good morning, everyone. You can see some interesting light effects on my face, I assume. So that's just the software doing its bit. So do not be alarmed. I think I will still be able to give the presentation as I meant to do. So, yes, thank you. That's the first slide. Now, we all have language as humans, but language is more than just a means of communication. It is also, it turns out, a kind of infrastructure that we use in order to shape modern society. Now, there are several problems when we're dealing with language as infrastructure, language as a technology. And one of them is, of course, polysemy, meaning that one and the same word or expression can have many different meanings. So that it turns out that bridge, in fact, can have several different meanings. Next slide, please. You can use bridge for the command center on a boat. You can use bridge in order to describe something going on in a router, and you can use bridge for a piece of infrastructure in the landscape. Now, what you're seeing on the slide in front of you is an object, and you probably recognize it as the thing, the thingy that you put between objects on the conveyor belt in a supermarket. Now, what is this thing called? Many people don't know or don't care. They simply take the thingy and put it in its place when needed. But it turns out that all these objects have names and terms for them, and we do need to be able to name them. Otherwise, our software systems, for example, when you want to order this kind of object online, would not be possible. Next slide, please. It's also the case that certain terms change their meaning and also the kinds of objects that they can refer to over time. So here you see that a phone has meant different things over the course of the ages. Next, please. Another example of thingies that are hard to name for many people. Next, please. Another example. Next, please. Now, standards depend on terminology, as Emanuela has already mentioned. We need terms in order to be able to standardize, because otherwise we don't have a way of naming the different things, concepts, and objects that we want to standardize. So what does this look like in a standard? Well, we have a clause in the standard that lists terms and their definitions. And this is a way of ensuring that the readers have the same understanding of the term when they are working with the document or applying it. Next, please. Now you can organize concepts in different ways. Sometimes we have a list of terms that is alphabetical. In other cases, we will structure the list in the standards based on the relationship between different concepts. So here you can see an example of a taxonomic relationship where you can organize concepts and then also the terms referring to the concepts based on the relationship they have to each other. So you could, for example, have a subclause for coniferous tree, and then you had another subclause for broadleaf tree instead of going by the alphabet. Next, please. It's also possible to organize concepts in terms of part-to-whole relationships or partitive relationships, and you get the mereonymy, which shows you what is a part of what or what parts something contains. Next, please. Now, there are different kinds of definitions, and we do need to have definitions because, as we just saw in the beginning, words can have different meanings, and when we want to use language as a technology, we need to fix those meanings in place. And the way of doing this, at least for human speakers, is to make definitions. Now we have several kinds of definitions. On the left, you have an intentional definition. For example, if you look at noble gas, a gas that is in the natural state is chemically inactive. So this is taking the concept gas, which is above noble gas in the taxonomy, and then telling us how it is differentiated from other concepts under that same hyponym. On the right side, you have a different kind of definition, an extensional definition, where you simply list all the different sub-concepts it can refer to. Next, please. Now, we encounter quite a lot of problems when we try to define terms in standards, as in other places in society. Now, what is wrong with this definition? Well, you can see that evergreen is repeated in the definition of the term evergreen tree. So we have a case of, next please, a circular definition. This we need to avoid. So here, now it seems that we had the wrong slide. That's probably my mistake. Please go back. Yeah, so the slide which should have been instead of this one is a slide that tells you that you should not repeat the word evergreen in the definition. This was an older version of the presentation for some reason. Next slide, please. So how do we structure terminological entries in standards? Well, there are actually two standards that tell us how to structure terminology in standards. And these two standards are the ones you can see on the screen. And this is where you go in order to get a deep dive into how to structure terminological entries in standards. Next, please. These are examples of terminological entries in standards. As you can see, we can indicate the source, the pronunciation, we can add symbols, and many other things. Next, please. We can even add illustrations. And we can also tell you which terms are preferred and which are permitted and which terms are deprecated. Next, please. We can also have quite complex terminological entries. Yes. Next, please. Here you can see an example with a table, and another very important thing. We have a note 1 to entry. So first we have the definition, that is the text starting with error of indication. And within that definition, we have references to other terminological entries in the same standard. And then we have extra information in the note. So that's not a part of the definition, but it is very useful information that you may need when you will want to work with this concept. Next slide, please. So these are two standards that go a little deeper into the field of terminology and tells you how to work out certain terminologies, how to work with concepts, how to harmonize concepts and terms, and so on. So these are two other ISO standards that can help you to work out the terminology that you need. Next slide, please. This is an example from one of the standards I just showed you, showing how we conceptualize reality into concepts. And this then becomes manifest in the terminologies that we have in the standards. So, and this is a process of abstraction. Next slide, please. Now, at the top level, we have something called the ISO/IEC directives, which tell the standardization organizations how to develop standards and how to structure standards. Now, this part 2 of the directives tells us how we should structure standard documents, and they also contain rules about terminology and terminological entries. And so this directive, in fact, also points to those and other standards that I showed you, and tells us that we actually are bound to use those standards when we develop new standards. Next slide, please. So this is from this directive and shows you the different options that you have when making a terminological entry in a standard. Next slide, please. Now we come to a very, very important point, and that is that we have just said that terminology is a very important part of standardization. Without terminology, without the technology of language used in this particular way, there is no standardization. So standardization needs terminology. But it is also the other way around, because the standardization process, where we work in committees to develop standards in different kinds of fields, also develops new terminology. And this is an extremely important point, that we have a mutual relationship between the two domains, so that terminology influences standards and standards influence terminology. And this is also evident when we translate terminology into different languages, because we then also create new terminologies in the target languages. Next slide, please. So I'm now coming to the end of my presentation, almost. So just to show you how what sort of tools one can work with, we have a project that's an international project where we have developed a terminological database. This is a cooperation between Danish Standards, the Swedish Standardization Institute, Standards Norway, and Austrian Standards International. Next slide, please. So this is a website that you can go to, termlexics.org, and here you can search for terms in standards. So it's a little bit similar to the OBP, the online browsing platform that ISO has, but you have access to more data because we also have the national and European level in this database. Next slide, please. So this database is based on published standards. So when a standard is published in XML format, we process that, the terms and definitions go into this database, and it is then accessible to online users. It's also possible to access it via an API, which is a service that Standard Online provides. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide, just some screenshots to show you what sort of options you have when you use this database. You can search for terms occurring in certain standards, and you can also see the different entries side by side and see the notes and filter by language. Yeah. Okay, I think that's all I have to say for now. Thank you. We can close my part of the presentation. I think you have some extra slides there. I do not think we have time for that now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivo. Now I can share my screen, and we have one question from our colleagues, Emanuela and Ivo. Just give me a second. Hopefully you can see my screen. Okay, so we're going to ask you to please go to the website menti.com and use code 73300921 and answer the question: are you or your organization participating or have ever participated in projects where standards are involved? You can just simply scan the QR code you see on the screen. Okay, we're going to wait a couple of minutes. Okay, 83% yes, 17% no. Ivo, do you, or Emanuela maybe, do you want to comment on these responses?
Emanuela, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is very good to see. It's really very good to see. There are a lot of initiatives, and of course the result can be improved with less no's, but I think it's very, very encouraging result.
I agree, very encouraging result.
Yes.
Thank you very much, both Emanuela and Ivo. I will stop sharing my screen, and Ossi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And there's my presentation as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present Norway's work with development, dissemination, and accessibility of terminology, and the role of terminology work in the national language policies of Norway here at this HSBooster training session. I will start out with a short presentation of the Language Council of Norway and our work with coordinating the Norwegian public sector's implementation of Norway's national language policies. The main goal of these policies is to maintain and strengthen Norwegian as a complete language and to prevent domain loss to English. Terminology and language use for professional purposes hold a central role in Norwegian language policies, and I will address this role more in detail with a quick overview of the situation for the Norwegian language as my starting point. Towards the end of my presentation, I will focus on the role of terminology in digitization and in terminology and language for professional purposes role in increased efficiency, simplification, and improvement of products and services. But first, just a short presentation of my organization, the Language Council of Norway. Our purpose is to strengthen the Norwegian language and the language diversity in Norway. The Language Council is the state's consultative body on language issues, and we follow up Norway's language policy on assignment for the Ministry of Culture and Equality here in Norway. Next slide, please. Norwegian is the first language of the vast majority of the Norwegian population, and the language has around 5.5 million daily speakers. Its status as Norway's primary national language was laid down in law in 2022 in the Norwegian Language Act. Norwegian has two written standards with equal status. They are named Norwegian Bokmål and Norwegian Nynorsk. But unlike the situation in many other European countries, Norwegian has no official spoken standard. On a global scale, Norwegian is a fairly robust and thriving language. Since around the turn of the millennium, the increasing use of English in many areas of society has, however, led to a concern that Norwegian may lose central linguistic domains. So in the mid-2000s, as a response to this, Norway established a national language policy focusing on the need to prevent domain loss, to maintain Norwegian as a complete language, that is, a language that can be used in all areas of society. For Norwegian to be a complete language, it needs updated terminology for all areas of knowledge. Therefore, the continuous development of Norwegian terminology has been a main priority in the national language policies. Before I go into details about policies regarding terminology, I'll give you a brief overview of how Norway's language policy is organized in general. Next slide, please. The overall responsibility for defining national language policy goals and coordinating the implementation of our language policies lies with the Norwegian Ministry of Culture and Equality. The operational responsibility for the national language policy is delegated to us in the Language Council of Norway as a subordinate body of the ministry. Monitoring, standardizing, and aggregating knowledge about the language situation is an important part of our activities. But unlike many of our sister bodies in other European countries, the Norwegian Language Council does not have research as part of its mandate. In 2009, the Language Council was given the task of being national coordinating body of Norwegian terminology work. There are two important characteristics of Norwegian language policy. Firstly, it's cross-sectorial. This means that all sectors of government are responsible for implementing the national language policy goals and to take language issues into consideration when designing their own sector-specific policies. And secondly, we consider the national language as a basic societal infrastructure, not only as an object of culture. An implication of this cross-sectorial language policy is that neither the Language Council nor the Ministry of Culture and Equality has a mandate to enforce policies in other sectors. Furthermore, the Language Act contains no provisions for sanctioning breaches of the legislation. And this means that the Language Council must promote language policies through other means, such as guidance, coordination, and distribution of best practice examples across sectors. The approach to language as an infrastructure, as much as a cultural object, may seem unfamiliar to some, but we believe that this description makes sense in a political context, and the infrastructure metaphor supports and pinpoints the need to develop and maintain language in all areas of society and also in professional life. The main principles of Norway's present language policy, including the focus on preventing domain loss, were first formulated in a government white paper 20 years ago, but these principles were only laid down in legislation in 2022 in Norwegian's Language Act, which I showed you. Accompanying this act, the Language Act of 2022, was a white paper including interpretative notes to each section of the act. The notes to section 1 affirm that the responsibility for using, developing and strengthening Norwegian entails an explicitly pronounced responsibility for ensuring that terminology is being developed for both written standards of Norwegian. In the consultation process before the law was put into action, the Language Council argued that the Act should contain a section specifically addressing terminology, in line with, for example, the Swedish language legislation. But unfortunately, our arguments didn't gain traction. However, the legislative history, including the notes to each session, clearly establishes that all public bodies in Norway have a legal responsibility for developing Norwegian terminology in their own field. Next slide, please. The main documents on language policy have specified certain areas of society as particularly important for maintaining Norwegian as a complete language. Among these are the sector of higher education and research, the health sector, the digital domain, and the standardization sector. Next slide, please. Furthermore, language policy documents emphasize that the higher education and research sector is particularly crucial for the development of Norwegian language for specific purposes. The reason for this being that research is perhaps the most important source of new concepts, and thus for new terminology. And because the language used in research and higher education often spreads quickly into other areas of society, such as public administration, the mass media, and primary education. In addition to the Language Act, the responsibility for development and use of Norwegian language for specific purposes is explicitly stated in Norway's new Act on Universities and University Colleges, which will be in function from the 1st of August this year. The wording on this point is more direct and more forceful than has been stated in previous acts, and also mirrors the wording of the Language Act, demonstrating that the Language Act constitutes a kind of governing legislation in the sense that it governs the design of more sector-specific language legislation. Now I'll give some examples of how language policy concerning terminology has been put into actual practice. And next slide, please. The Language Council has developed courses and mentoring programs for experts who want to work with developing terminology in their own fields of expertise. In the early 2010s, we started to systematically promote terminology development in the higher education sector. We carried out pilot projects where expert groups, under the guidance of our in-house terminologists, produced and registered terminology in term bases. Based on these projects, we established methods for terminology work in the higher education sector, which since has been applied by experts groups involved in terminology work in different fields of expertise, ranging from astronomy and climate research to theoretical linguistics and gender research. And together with the Norwegian Digitalisation Agency, we have also developed a freely available e-learning course in terminology and concept work, and it's named Begrip begrepene. Next slide, please. Around 2010, the Language Council started advocating the establishment of a national web portal for term bases. A prototype for such a portal was designed at the Norwegian School of Economics in the early 2010s, but for it to become a national portal capable of hosting and maintaining term bases from all sectors, it needed permanent funding on a large scale. In the following years, the Language Council joined forces with the Norwegian School of Economics, the University of Bergen, as well as several organizations responsible for managing term bases to advocate funding for a public national terminology portal. 2021 saw a breakthrough in this respect as the Ministry of Culture and Equality, together with the Ministry of Higher Education and Research, decided on a joint funding of the portal amounting to about €400,000 annually. This web portal is called Termportalen, or the terminology portal in English, and it's now managed by the University of Bergen. From 2024 onwards, the funding of the portal is doubled, meaning that the University of Bergen is in an even better position to develop a portal with terminology from a vast array of fields. In our capacity as a national coordinator of the development of terminology, the Language Council of Norway has entered into a strategic partnership with the University of Bergen in order to ensure that the portal is being developed in accordance with national language policy goals. Next slide, please. There have been positive developments for Norwegian terminology also in other sectors and domains. Norway has come a long way in digitizing the public sector, including a wide range of public services. The work to digitize public services has stressed the importance of unambiguous terminology as a prerequisite for clear and precise communication and for the efficient sharing of data. In parts of the public sector, we have seen increased awareness of the need to identify, define, and distribute terminology. The Norwegian Digitalisation Agency has developed a database for the sharing of data between public bodies, and this base includes a section for registering and describing relevant concepts and establishing terms. Also, over many years, the standardization organizations of Norway have been close partners to the Language Council in our efforts to promote Norwegian terminology, and they have prioritized the registration of Norwegian terminology in their term bases. We heard from Emanuela Roques and Ivo Spiros' fine contribution here about Standards Norway and their work with terminology from a great variety of standards. The Language Council has signed an agreement to collaborate on terminology issues with Standards Norway, and we also collaborate with the Norwegian Electrotechnical Committee, who manages term base for electrotechnical terminology. In the health sector, there's a large ongoing project in the Norwegian Directorate of eHealth to establish a Norwegian version of the international SNOMED terminology of clinical terms. In this project, more than 100,000 terms will be translated into Norwegian from the English version of the term base. A long-term goal of this work is to also develop patient-friendly terms that can cooperate with the professional clinical terms, and in this way facilitate digital production of records for professional healthcare workers and records in patient-friendly plain language in dual. This would both increase efficiency and improve the communication with the patients. The political breakthrough and improvements I've outlined show that important sectors are recognizing that terminology is crucial for coordination, for cross-sectorial digitization, and for better services, higher efficiency, quality assurance, and product development, both in public service and business. I'm nearing the end of my talk, and I'll round off by reflecting on the question, what lies ahead for Norway's terminology work? Next slide, please. First of all, there are still some significant challenges that have to be tackled. The awareness of the importance of terminology and the actual development of terminology are unevenly distributed across different sectors of society. The Language Council experiences that it is easy to argue for the importance of terminology when we relate it to digitization processes and the effort to create high-quality digital public services or measures to increase cost efficiency. However, it's harder to convince people that clear and consistent terminology is crucial for efficient communication regardless of the context or the medium. One recent trend that may boost the awareness of terminology is efforts to create AI models trained on high-quality Norwegian language data. Several research communities have ongoing projects aimed at creating GPT-style large language models that reflect Norwegian culture, Norwegian values, and Norwegian language. These have to be trained on Norwegian language corpora, and this also highlights the need for domain-specific corpora with high-quality Norwegian terminology. A sufficient number of terminology experts is a prerequisite for developing and managing terminology on a scale that meets the need of society. Unfortunately, terminology has long been in decline as a field of study and research in Norway. There is an urgent need for a strong research and education community in this field. However, there is reason to be optimistic. The increased funding of Termportalen and the terminology staff already managing the web portal may lay the foundation for such a research community. Also, a planned research center for Norwegian language for professional purposes may well give a boost to terminology research. I'm finishing off now by saying that the Norwegian Language Act places terminology at the center stage of Norwegian language policy, and policymakers have recognized that Norwegian terminology may provide a bulwark against domain loss. The policies concerning terminology are tied in with other aspects of the national language policy, such as the work to promote the status of Norwegian and the efforts to create corpora for language technology. What we have then is a number of cases that highlight the interconnectedness of language policies. And that makes me very optimistic that in the years to come, we will see an even greater awareness of the need for terminology work and work on language for professional purposes in all parts of the Norwegian society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for such an inspiring presentation. Once again, I'm going to share my screen and ask you to go to the website, join us at menti.com, use the code 69239925 and answer the question: does your country have a national repository for storing and sharing terminology in your local languages? Once again, it's a yes or no question, and you can just scan the QR code you see on the screen. Okay, we're going to wait a couple of minutes. Okay, so we have the majority says no. We have 57%, 63% no, and 38% yes. Lucy, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, they are interesting results. Sharing of terminology is getting more and more important, and sharing of language data generally is of huge importance for developing large language models. So I think the aspect of sharing language data and sharing terminology will be more and more in focus in the years to come.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this comment. It is interesting, definitely, to see. And we have no further responses. I will stop sharing my screen and I invite Magnus to take the floor. Magnus, the floor is yours.
Excellent. So, hi everybody. I had a bit much coffee today, so I'll try to speak slowly. It might be a bit difficult. First, I want to make a kind of side also here from something I picked up while we were preparing this, and she used the concept of terminology being infrastructure. I find that highly interesting. I'm going to loop back to that bit further down in my presentation. I can maybe do my next slide, please. So obviously I'm Magnus. I'm just going to give you a bit brief background of me. So you got something in the beginning from Ivana, but I am also engaging ISO TC37, which is on terminology, and I'm in the national committee with Ivo. So I find that also interesting. Now, what does my company do, and why are we engaged in terminology? Why do my company pay for me participating in terminology? There needs to be a business objective or a motivation for this. Well, we are in, as House of Knowledge, we're in a lot of doing training and education. And if we want to convey a message or make people understand something, it's very important for us to be consistent, and the words we use actually convey a message the receiver can understand. So we could build a fundament. And such a fundament is part of infrastructure of communication, and then building on what Åse said. What we do with this and how we do training, I'm not going to use any time on that, is that we use something called serious games, which is interactive ways of engaging people, of teaching each other. And when we do that, it's very essential that they can make a common understanding, meaning when they talk and then you use references, everybody can understand what the others are talking about, meaning we need a consistent terminology or language so we can actually communicate properly. I think we could go to my next slide. So this is a picture which could resemble any standards committee. And as you could see, and what was mentioned in the beginning, I'm the convener, which means leader of a working group of terminology at ISO level. It is on innovation terminology, and that might sound like herding cats, and it started out like herding cats. But why would my company be engaged in innovation terminology? Well, it puts us at the table. It makes us relevant, because when we work with other companies and we deliver training or we do consultancy, we need to sometimes do measurements. We need to get to understand their needs and their problems. And again, language and terminology is at the core. If I need insights for supporting them in understanding something, I need indicators and metrics to understand this. And all of that is built on precise definitions. And without that, I might not be able to trust the information and data I collect. It creates some sort of interoperability of databases, and I will save a lot of time. So that's how we got engaged in this. And it's highly valuable for us as a company. And just make an example of how much we invested in this. From what we got engaged back in 2008, we invested about 40k euros a year in travel, not including my working time, to establish and engage in innovation terminology around Europe and then globally. And we still think that is a very, very good investment. Now, I'll make another example of why we see terminology is relevant. Well, starting out with building a best practice guideline for how to do innovation management in Europe, the ISO 165555 series. At the end of the work, we had kind of a big quarrel. We had all the relevant countries of Europe sitting in the same room with delegations, experts in innovation, talking about how to manage innovations. The problem was they didn't talk about the same thing. We hadn't started out with terminology. So at the end of the meeting, I just came in and I said, okay, guys, time out. I toward the table and I said, you mean, we are all aligned. Can we please start with terminology? We should probably have started out with making those definitions 5 years ago to ease communication in establishing a best practice. So when that work went to ISO on a global scale, we took the experience from Europe, and I started out saying, okay, guys, to learn from Europe, let's start with terminology. Let's place a line about what are we talking about to ease communications and to ease communications among cultures. Now I'm moving back to a very powerful example. I'm not very religious. It's not linked to religion, my example now, but have you ever heard of the Tower of Babel? In the biblical tale of the Tower of the Babel, mankind tried to build a huge tower to reach the God. But the God didn't like that. So the God introduced languages. And what happens when you have a large population communicating and building something jointly and you introduce multiple languages? What happens is that we cease to communicate. We cease to work together. We get misunderstandings. We start fighting. We get war, and people are spread around the world. And the tower obviously came crashing down. Terminology is doing the exact opposite. We align around a common language to make sure we're all on the same page, so we can communicate, create interoperability and alignment, and remove misunderstandings, which is normally the cause of arguments and discussions and discomfort and sometimes even war. Terminology is the only divine tool possessed by mankind. Think about that. We got access to divine tool and we hardly use it. It's time to start using it. I think you could go to my next slide. Now, making this work on innovation terminology, which I am personally found highly sexy, is a really cool topic, terminology. And even when you get to the terminology of terminology, we got the 704 presented by Ivo earlier here, and there was a few in the chat. Have a look at those and the rules of how to build a language. It's very essential. When we started out defining innovation, I'll come back to why that is essential. That was quite difficult, and you probably heard that a dear child has many names. Well, that can be handled, because regardless of those names, everybody would know whom and what I'm talking about. Ivo mentioned something that when the opposite happens, you have a one name or term and it's used for multiple objects. Then the problems starts, because there's no precisions, there's no communications, and well, it's difficult. And when we're in the, I would say, forefront of research and innovation, creating new knowledge or new entities or something to support society, it's very essential that we can make a precise language, be able to communicate this. From a business perspective, that is very essential, because we need to market this. We need to communicate to our potential future customers to build our brands, to make sure that you understand what we're talking about when we are talking about our products, and that we are cutting edge. Well, we need terminology to do that, and we need you guys to adopt it. That's why terminology is so essential. So from a business perspective, terminology is essential for communication, for gathering data, getting business intelligence to know how to position my company, but also for branding and building my resume in the market. Now, moving back into the ISO terminology work. We started out with, in parallel with the work of the management system of innovation, we started work on the definitions. That was interesting, because my biggest problem was that my experts didn't even agree with themselves. We got different cultures. They've got different relations to the concepts, and when they left the room, got a coffee, came back, they had a new understanding. We needed to start agreeing on conceptually what are we talking about, and that is the core. And when we got that to work and we built a terminology structure, a concept diagram saying, this is the structure of concepts we need to define and give a name, the term, we succeeded, and we then gradually got the rest of the technical committee to join us in on this work. But we failed a bit, because when we were translating this into Norwegian, we met the problems mentioned by Åsa, is that we need to keep the domain relevant in Norwegian. And we weren't that good at it. The problem was that when we were trying to find Norwegian words for something, a Norwegian term for the definition, which we then translated, we got so stuck in the global domain that we were incapable of finding proper Norwegian terms. So we actually contributed to following our own language. And language and terminology is the core of culture. And if you want to build culture, you start out with the language and the terminology. But the good thing is that this standard on terminology is being revised, and it's going to be published as the ISO 56000 2025 early next year. And then we learn that next time we'll bring the Language Council along, and we'll make sure that there's no English or new Norwegian English terms in it, but it's purely Norwegian terms in the Norwegian document. Make sure that we can use innovation in Norwegian. And another example, or another document we continued with, because we figured out that a terminology document is highly technical, normally made for experts. So what we did is we created the ISO 56010, which you can see is illustrated examples of the terminology document, which is a lot of examples in use to make people get a conceptual and contextual understanding of what does the definition really means when applied, as a tool to support people when implementing work on innovation organization with their colleagues. And why would that be relevant? Well, I said that terminology is core of building culture, and the same goes for a company. If we want to succeed building an innovation culture, we need to start with what does innovation mean for the company? Meaning we're starting with the terminology, and then we can start communicating and getting everybody on board. That is why, and that is an epiphany my company got, is that is why we got so engaged in terminology, and so far have invested over 400k euros in just mere travel since 2008 in terminology development around the globe. For us, that was a small investment for a company of 2 people. I'm just saying how important that is. Now, what we did a bit more, because in order to get this to work, we need everybody to embrace, like seriously embrace the same language structure. So what we did is that we started looking around ourselves, saying which other ISO work or international work can we get to get on the same page, which are relevant. And we figured out the quality management system standard ISO is the most used standards in the world. Let's partner up with them. So we established a liaison internally in ISO. We got ISO 9000 and the 9001 to be on the same page as us, which means that 20 million companies around the globe will use the same definitions. It's by definition implemented, which is good. Now everybody uses the same, but that is not enough. And we didn't really have enough members. We had started out with 20 country members in the entire technical committee of ISO TC 279 on innovation management. We started an outreach because we need a lot more countries to embrace this standard, because when they embrace the standard and implement it nationally with a translation, we can use the same understanding around the globe. And we ended up with 72 countries at the moment, which is still less than half the world, but it's a good starting point in number of countries, in the number of, or in the population of the world, we're around 70% of the global population. But that's not enough. So what did we do? We figured out we need to get more people on board and where it really counts. How can we get the governments to understand how essential it is? Now, there is a document used by all governments in the entire world, on the entire planet, to measure innovation capabilities on a country basis. It's the OECD's document, the Oslo Manual, which is the capital of Norway. It actually started out in Norway 40 years ago. We teamed up with the OECD and NESTI, which is building the science indicators for innovation at the OECD. And we aligned and agreed on a common definition, which means the ISO 56000 and the OECD Oslo Manual 2018, to be updated in 2028, is on the same page. And we have the same understanding, which means the language used in businesses is the exact same used by governments for measuring it. It's a great day when that happened back in 2020 when both documents were published. We got business and government on the same page. We measure, we communicate, we get insights, and we're still on the same page. That is absolutely brilliant. But we got more on the board because in order to get the rest of the world on board, we also engaged with the World Bank. We got the global head of innovation, quality engaged. So I know they started using it to implement around the rest of the world. So we had an absolute outreach. But we also got the World Intellectual Property Organization and we got the World Trade Organization on board because we need to do this on a really global scale, doing trade around the globe. But we got them engaged in something called liaisons, because this kind of international organization, except the OECD, they can't be a partner in, but they can liaise, meaning we can exchange perspectives, create a common understanding to understand the perspectives of either organizations. And we ended up being on the same page with the OECD. That was a close partnership. We could go to my next slide, please. So to kind of wrap up what I just said, what is essential we kind of remember from what I just said is that common understanding of anything, terminology is at the core. And I say I'm reading my slide, but that's the intent, because now you got it afterwards. You also will get something else afterwards, which is the links to all the documents I referred to. Now, terminology is at the core of dissemination and communication. That goes for anything, and especially for research, which is in the cutting edge of innovation. If we can't establish a proper terminology, we're not being precise enough, and we're not communicating to the market, and adoption and dissemination is a bit difficult. It's essential for business culture, regardless of topic. We need to start out with what does something mean for us. But it also is the core of business intelligence when you mix terminology, indicator, and insights. We need that. It needs to be built on the same structure. So terminology and standards overview is something you need to start out with before you start on any innovation initiatives or research projects, because then you know that your document sending in for the application for governmental funding is consistent. You're consistent in your consortium. We're consistent even in my company or the partners developing something, and that will be highly relevant because we will reduce risk, uncertainty, and save money. And then my last words would be kind of a hint: establish company internal glossary with examples to build culture, reduce risk, and support plain and good language. Then you could go to my last slide. And if you found whatever any of us told you, please, you could add me on LinkedIn. And in my next slide, you could see that there's references and links to the documents I mentioned. And that would be the end of what I plan to say today in 19 minutes and 20 seconds. So I think that's just brilliant. So over to you, Biljana and Julia. And remember, life is good.
Thank you very much, Magnus, for your presentation. I will share my screen for the last time today and ask you once again to join us on the Mentimeter. use the code 29785167 and answer the question, when should we start with terminology work in a standard? So we have first, before or in parallel, during the work when you know more about your needs, or when the first standard is published. We're going to wait a couple of minutes. Okay. Magnus, do you want to comment?
Yes, I'm very glad that I managed to use a consistent terminology. So you got my message, as that was what I wrote in the last slide. We need to start out making a common understanding before or when we start cooperating. That is essential, or at least in parallel. Then it's easier. The critical minimum would be at least the one nobody voted for, which is good because you voted before or in parallel, would be when you started, at least to start doing something, because it will ease it and then you'll be ahead of time the next time you revise it. When the standard is published, it's normally too late and you need to wait another 3 to 5 years for a revision. But then you get inputs from the users, what the real needs are.
Thank you, Magnus, for these comments. We have 92% first, before or in parallel, and only 8% when the first standard is published. So I think these are good responses. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I will stop sharing my screen and give the floor back to Ivana.
Thank you, Biljana. Thank you all for your wonderful presentation. Please turn on your camera. We have short Q&A session, and we learned a lot about terminology, why it is important, and one question for all of you. Languages are changing and terminology in any discipline is evolving. How to prevent to have obsolete terminology in standards? Magnus, you would like to answer?
Yeah, the good thing is that we are revising terminology documents and standards. And there, at least every 3 to 5 years, we are looking into should we revise them. And when we're revising them, we can get global input in the last phase. So we get inputs from users. So we get it before we revise it. What is changed? Has anything changed? Can we make it more precise? So that's happening already. That's how standards work. And when the document is obsolete, it's being deleted or terminated. It's still available, but it's there. So it's being revised. For innovation, which is evolving fast, we have set a 2 years revision place. So meaning it's published and we restart publishing it. That is actually after a question by the World Trade Organization. Can we keep the speed to make sure that it's being continuously improved? So it's a very good question.
Ase, would you like to comment?
Yes, I think it's important to recognize that language work is always work in progress, and the only languages that never change, those are dead languages, and that is why we have to continuously revise our dictionaries, continuously have a public debate on language and on words, and that is why it's so important to sanction the terminology in the language user community. And we have to look upon this as part of the continuous work for improving services, improving standards, improving practices, and language is actually a center stage in this work of improvement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ivo, would you like to add something?
Yes, I might add something. So I wholeheartedly agree with what Magnus and also have already said. But I might point out that there is a tension here between controlled language and living language. And since we are using language as a technology in standardization, we to some degree want to control what the words mean, so making them into technical terms. And this, of course, means that there is a tension, and we need this revision process in order to have control over the changes that we make. Also, there is a technical aspect because computer systems need, well, they need fixed identifiers, and then also they need recognized interpretations of those identifiers that are accessible to humans. So we need both identifiers and we need human understandable definitions, but they still need to be controlled in a sense. Otherwise, if we sort of let evolution loose on technical terms, we no longer have a controlled technology. So there is a tension here.
Oh, thank you. Emanuela, do you want to comment the question or?
Yeah, a lot has been said, and I agree with everything that has been said so far. And yes, terminology and standards are continuously changing. They are in continuous change. So as, for example, Magnus was saying, it's important that we revise the standards. That first of all, we take them in use, that we comment on them, and that we revise them as terminology changes.
Thank you so much. Do you have any final remarks on our topics today? Magnus, would you like to say take-home message, maybe?
Yeah, so you need to think that if you want to do anything, you need to make sure that you're speaking the same language. So take the time to know the context of whom you're talking to, and then life will be good.
Okay, so thank you so much. Ase, would you like to tell us take-home message?
I would like to stress Magnus's point that terminology work is actually a vital part of standardization work, and it should not be done after the standards are finished. This is so important for security, for good products, for good work processes, and it's an important investment for everybody.
Thank you so much. Ivo, would you like to point some take-home message from our training today?
Yes, I mean, I think it really pays off to learn something about terminology and how to deal with it, how to develop it, how to understand it, how to deploy it. And there are many resources for this. Of course, in practice, you can simply start by joining a standardization committee, of course, but there are training sessions and courses and so on available many places. And simply starting to get a basic grip of what a definition is and how concepts are related to each other, and phenomena like polysemy and homonymy and so on is a good starting point. And then you will be much, much better equipped to write good standards and to contribute to society.
Thank you so much. Emanuela, would you like to point some take-home message?
Yes, I would say that remember that standardization projects can uncover knowledge needs, can lead to new research projects, so that research and standardization are directly linked and really contribute to knowledge, to the valorization of knowledge. So that is, and I agree on all the points and the comments that have been made so far.
Thank you so much. We have one question more. Ivo, could you please provide example of the courses you mentioned?
Well, I think I would have to come back to you with concrete links and so on in that case. So,
yeah.
But I'm happy to do that, of course. And there are, of course, also resources I might point you to. So
Yes.
if there is a possibility to send out information after this training session, we might do that.
Yes, we will send to all participants. Please let me, thank you so much. I will share my presentation now and tell us once more. Thank you, Emanuela, Ivo, Asse, and Magnus for this wonderful training session. We have learned a lot today, and I hope that in our future work, research consortia, research project will be better after this session. Thank you so much once more. For the closure,
thank you for having us.
Thank you. For the closure of this training session, I would like to point, please visit our HSBooster Training Academy. We have provided material to improve your knowledge, even if you are a beginner or if you are experienced in standardization. I think that every researcher interested in standardization can find something in it. We are especially proud on our HSBooster training session. Up to now, we have 10 training sessions, and you can find it on our Zenodo and YouTube channel. Just last information, I would like to announce our next webinar. It is a new series of webinars designed to explore intersection of artificial intelligence and standardization. On June 27, we will have a webinar on artificial intelligence standardization with use cases and explanation of what we learned from researchers and project Horizon Europe and Horizon 2020 projects. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Thank you for being with us. And we are looking to see our next webinars and events. Once more, thank you. See you soon.